Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IOP Forum. My name is Lauren Schuker, and as president of the Harvard Crimson, I have the privilege to say a few words about Frank Rich tonight, whose newspaper career began right here in Cambridge just 37 years ago. During his time at Harvard, Mr. Rich wrote 86 articles for the Crimson. And today, the mere mention of his name and his byline in the newsroom still inspires awe and admiration among fellow crime-eds, as we call ourselves. But behind every great success story lies a very humble beginning. In light of that, I want to share with you a few lines from the very first piece that Mr. Rich wrote for the Crimson. Just wait. The article was published on Monday, March 25th, in 1968, just days before Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot, and when Mr. Rich was but a freshman. It was a theater review of a science fiction fantasy play called The Invention of Morel. Even as an 18-year-old, Rich had already developed a writing style that was blindingly honest, breathtakingly eloquent, and devastatingly sardonic. He began that first Crimson article with the lead, and I quote, "By the time The Invention of Morel finally decides to stop loitering about the Lowell House dining room and get going, the last act is nearly over." He described the narrator as a, quote, "sort of supernatural Walt Disney," and the special effects as, quote, "idle threats of impending excitement." Rich offered little clemency to the cast and director, conceding only that, quote, "the script's vagueness could have been eliminated, but the production's lack of technical proficiency was unavoidable." But more seriously, Rich has always possessed a theatrical sensibility that enables him to understand the political pantomime of Washington in powerful ways. His writing hones in on how a cast of characters can play their roles out on the political stage. In November of 1970, just 2 years before the Watergate break-in and the Washington Post's historic coverage of that break-in, Rich wrote a Crimson story about Nixon, which was aptly titled "The Bavarian Candidate." And I quote from that. Quote, "There was actually a time in this country when we used to ask ourselves periodically, which new Richard Nixon was the real Richard Nixon," the 21-year-old Rich wrote. That is no longer. We have adjusted to the fact that the real Nixon, if he exists at all, will never reveal himself. It is enough now to merely try and decipher all the nuances of the current Nixon and let it go at that, unquote. Discerning between who is real or genuine and who is an imposter, navigating the new and the current have long been Rich's strengths. Though he has come a long way since covering undergraduate plays for the Crimson, one still gets the impression that sometimes Rich reviews the political scene as though it were a pageant, or more recently, the theater of the absurd. Today, Crimson editors and young journalists across America look to Frank Rich as our example of a journalist who is writing pieces of consequence and gravity. And we are excited to hear what he has to say tonight about propaganda in the news and politics. So without further ado, let's get this show started. Interviewing our esteemed guest tonight is the director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on Press and Public Policy. He's covered the press for the New York Times from 1983 to 1992, and he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1987. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Jones.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad you're here, and I'm extremely pleased that Frank Rich is here and his wife Alex Witchell as well. Early in the semester, I was asked by one of the new arriving Shorenstein Fellows from Australia, who I thought the most important columnist and commentator on America was now, and I said without any hesitation, Frank Rich. I absolutely believe that. Frank's column, which appears on the front page of the Arts and Leisure section of the New York Times every Sunday, is must-reading, I think, probably for everyone, most everyone certainly, in this room, and for a lot of other people as well. His column, as I understand it, is framed to be the place where politics and culture intersect, and I think that Frank has interpreted that broadly. In recent months, he has been especially focused on the issue of propaganda and the news, perhaps better propaganda in the news. Frank, as Lauren was saying, was originally at the New York Times the drama critic beginning in 1980, and he was probably, during the 1980s, one of the most genuinely reviled people in the theater world. And I think from his 18-year-old review, you could see why. He was also always lucid, clear-eyed, tough, very, very insightful, ruthlessly honest. And his work was always infused with a genuine love of the theater. And I think that is the thing that was the elevating element, even beyond all of the genuine criticism and serious criticism that made so many people angry. I can tell you that many, many times at the New York Times, Frank and I were there at the same time, and when you're from the New York Times in those days and you go out to a dinner party, people would say, "Do you know Frank Rich?" And they would say usually, "You know, I couldn't stand that review, but damn it, I saw the play and he was exactly right." That is actually, in fact, the way it was. He was right then, and I think quite seriously that he's right now. By the way, any of you who are not aware of it, Frank grew up in Washington, and one of my favorite books of the ones he has written is a lovely memoir of his childhood called Ghostlight, which gets at where his love of the theater came from. And the fact that that love of theater was born in Washington may have something to do with his sort of taste for the theatrical in the political as well. In the 1990s, Frank shifted from being a drama critic to being an op-ed columnist. And his column, which was semi-weekly on the op-ed page, then moved to a weekly column in the arts and leisure section. He has taken on many, many controversial topics. He had a thin skin, or rather a thick skin, when he was a drama critic. He has remained with that thick skin. Some of you who are followers of his for a long time know that he was perhaps almost alone in his willingness to take on Mel Gibson and The Passion of the Christ for its anti-Semitism on the one hand, and also its sort of self-regarding promotion that was masked as a kind of religious thing. It sort of roused the passion of Mel Gibson, I think it's fair to say. Mel Gibson was quoted as saying of Frank, "I want to kill him. I want his intestines on a stick. I want to kill his dog." Frank's response was, "I don't have a dog." His prime topic these days is what he sees as the White House propaganda machine that is working overtime and quite beautifully. Tonight, our conversation is going to be about propaganda, news, and politics, plus whatever comes up that is generally on our subject. It's a time of staggering change in the communications business and also in terms of technology. It's a very dangerous time. The country is nominally at war. It's also a very dangerous time in that the news that we depend upon to inform our democracy is, to many minds, genuinely imperiled. Frank, let me welcome you, and let me say, first of all, let me ask you, is this news that we have regarded as the essential blood supply for an informed public that makes a democracy work, is this, to your mind, genuinely imperiled?
First of all, thank you, and thank you. I'm sort of mortified by my old language, which I had lost. The invention of morale, I'm trying to remember it, probably was not in my right mind when I saw it. Yes, I think it is. We're in this paradoxical situation where there have never been more news sources before than there are now. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way, Alex. If when we were kids and news junkies, if we could have had all these internet sites and all this news on television as opposed to just 3 networks with 15 minutes of news a night, we would have, been in heaven, and being able to get out of town papers, at a click. And yet, strangely, it seems that the truth, or some, as close as journalism can get to the truth, is getting harder and harder to find. And to me, there are many reasons for it that are not all necessarily related to each other. One is a structural change in television. Television is the main means now by which people get their news without question. And over the past decade or two, we've seen a steady erosion of network news departments as they've been forced to become profit centers rather than public service operations. And so the days when CBS would spend years losing money on 60 Minutes when it had bad ratings to do quality journalism, that's gone. If anyone's even going to start a primetime news show, it's not going to be investigative. It's probably going to be crime and celebrity driven. We have a decline of newspapers as chains have bought them, as they've been whittled away by their own commercial pressures. We still have some very good newspapers in this country, and I'm very happy to be working for one of them. But generally speaking, there's a kind of McDonald's quality to a lot of papers around the United States. They've been franchised and sort of milked for whatever can be got out of advertising without journalism sort of ruling it. And then on top of that, we have a government, and while it's particularly true of this administration, in my view, it's not just true of this administration, that has become very slick at completely co-opting the news and creating its own sense of reality, is what Ron Suskind, I think, wrote in his Times Magazine piece about the Bush administration. He quoted one of its media people as saying, you know, we don't care about sort of the reality-based world of journalism in places like the New York Times, and they can create their own Truman Show, their own reality. And then Americans are harried. You know, they can't, sure, there are some people who can spend all day poring over the internet and weighing one news source against another, but most people have jobs to do. They've got to get on with their lives, and they're getting bits and pieces of what? They may be getting something that's propaganda, they may get something that's advocacy, or they may be getting real news, and you can't blame them for finding it difficult to adjudicate what's what. To me, one of the most, there are two really revealing things I think of over the past couple of years. One is that so many Americans believe, and I believe have believed, and still, I think close to half, still believe that Iraqis attacked on 9/11, and that shows a fundamental failure of the news environment. And the polls I've seen suggest it's not just Republicans, it's Republicans and Democrats equally. It's not ideology driven necessarily, even if some propaganda got into the mix and influenced that opinion. And then, you know, in the Times Jason Blair scandal, one of the many self-destructive incidents that have hurt the mainstream press, we had a reporter was, among other things, fictionalizing accounts of Jessica Lynch's family, the American soldier killed injured in the war, and we learned that they never even bothered to call and complain because they just assumed that's what newspapers do. They just make stuff up and give them a front yard they didn't have or whatever.
I found that particularly galling and frightening myself. I want to dig down on the issue of propaganda, though. I mean, I think it's very tempting to go in lots of different directions. Yeah. I want us to look at propaganda. The word propaganda didn't really enter this sort of lexicon of criticism of the Bush administration in a really serious way, it seems to me, until that video news release story that appeared on the front page of the New York Times.
Last
year. Then, when that started it, and then Armstrong Williams really made it into full flower. Now, I want to look at the word propaganda because that's a powerful word. That's like the word liar, kind of. It has an extra kind of measure of power. It's not the same as unfair or mean or things like that. It really carries a lot of special weight. What do you mean when you say the White House propaganda machine, as opposed to the White House sort of Mike Deaver promotion machine?
Well, I guess they're related. I mean, when you go back to the Reagan administration and Mike Deaver, and you, for that matter, go back to the Kennedy administration, beginning particularly with the television era, or really beginning with the the rise of broadcasting, including radio, because you think of things that, for instance, FDR did. There's always been a certain theatricality and showmanship involved in the White House. And it's not as if FDR didn't have, Robert Sherwood, the playwright, working on his speeches and therefore his image, and had other things. And we've seen, obviously through the Kennedy years, and then this go much further in the Reagan years, where Mike Deaver was brilliant at, figuring out that pictures could trump reality to such an extent that even as the Reagan budget was cutting, hypothetically, hospital money, Reagan would be shown, cutting a ribbon for a hospital opening, and that would drown out the words on the evening news. But we're seeing, and Clinton was capable of this. They've all had, Clinton had his handlers and his own show business stuff. But I think we're seeing something a bit different when we find people posing as news people, being paid, and fake, eyewitness news teams in reports paid for by the taxpayers being put in the conveyor belt and ending up in local news shows around the country. That's a little bit different than, say, George Bush appearing in front of a drop like this that says, renewing Social Security as many times as this says, John F. Kennedy School. Stagecraft is one thing, but actually fictionalizing the players and fictionalizing the message. One thing about those initial fake news people, those reports, were not only were they fake in the sense that they're saying, I'm Karen Ryan reporting, and she wasn't a reporter, and she's interviewing people from the administration saying how great the prescription drug plan is in the Medicare program. But as the General Accountability Office found, the information was also false. So it wasn't only a false presentation, it was actually fictional information, and actual eyewitness teams around the country were presenting it as news, and it found, according to one report, found itself not on CNN itself, but through a CNN service that services local stations by giving them news packages. It just went into the conveyor belt and went out. And I feel in all these cases, the Armstrong Williams case and the Jeff Gannon case, which I'm sure we'll get to, we don't know all the facts. We don't know what's going on, but this definitely is, to me, it smells like something different than just slick stagecraft and Morning in America and fireside chats and Kennedy on a yacht. The kind of stage management we've seen and theatricality we've seen in the past.
Well, it's one way to look at it is to think of it as a sort of evolution of the concept of what is permissible and acceptable in terms of public relations. In public relations, in press agentry, I mean, you start with the idea of press releases that provide information, hypothetically, that reporters take and then use to their own purposes and take and examine further and whatnot. But now, over time, that has migrated to video news releases, and the video news releases that were fundamental, the ones that were created, and they've been around for a long time.
Right.
They were ones that were made to look like television news segments, but they did not have people posing as reporters in them.
With a mic doing stand-up.
And identifying themselves as someone reporting. I get my point, my question is this. The way it sort of looks to me is that people like both executives in the administration and in senior, not just maybe this administration, but people who have a shrewdness about these things, looked out at the survey of the media about what was possible. And they saw a great opportunity because they saw either a vulnerability or a laziness or a weakness or a lack of rigor or something that said to them, if we put this together, if we do it the way we want, we can get not only for them to cover the stories that we pitch to them, we can increasingly create and provide them with the content that will then appear in their stories as though it were reported objective news.
Right, but there's one problem here. It's illegal. It is illegal for the government, according to the GAO, to present that kind of material without identifying it as coming from the government. So the GAO has found the Karen Ryan stuff illegal. They're investigating the Armstrong-Williams case. So we don't know where that's going to come out yet. But the whole public relations business, because the way this works is, the contract is made by, say, the Department of Education with a huge PR firm, a PR firm that may also have many private industry clients, not just handling government agencies, which then hires someone else, like this Karen Ryan worked for a PR company that I think had something to do with the pharmaceutical industry. Armstrong-Williams had a PR company. So it's funneled through these layers and then comes out in this form. And I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of all of it, what people knew and when they knew it. And Rick Hertzberg had a very good piece in the New Yorker this week saying, given that the party in power also controls both houses of Congress, we may not find out because we don't have a Sam Ervin in a position to really do it. The press is obviously trying to do it.
Well, I hope the New York Times is going to find a disaffected former employee of Ketchum Communications who is going to blow the whistle on it.
By the way, what I was starting to say about Ketchum Communications is
Ketchum Communications was the outfit that was behind much of the Bush administration hiring of Armstrong-Williams, the video news releases, things like that has been revealed thus far.
It's a huge, these firms are largely, be a great book for someone, invisible to the American public, because it doesn't just involve government, it involves a lot of things that you're sold. But when the Armstrong-Williams thing first broke, Ketchum sort of said, not our problem, Armstrong-Williams is a grown-up basically, and can do what he wants to do. But then there was a huge flurry within the public relations industry itself that was upset about possible ethical breaches. And now there's a lot of soul searching there too. And I hope that soul searching may lead to more public information. I put in a request for a column I was writing to Ketchum to find out where I think they've gotten something like $90-odd million worth of government money, and I put in a request to their people asking where the rest of it went. But beyond, the $240,000 to Armstrong-Williams, I'm still waiting to hear.
Did they tell you they wanted to kill your dog? I mean,
they don't. No, they told me they'd get back to me.
They are silent. They have been silent.
Yeah. Well, and why? There's a lot to be found out, I think.
One of the things that is part of this overall package, especially in terms of the administration, is not just this phenomenon that has aroused a lot of interest in the covert propaganda sense, but the idea of controlling the message and controlling access and attacking enemies, and it's an amazingly efficient strategy, it seems to me, that is being pursued opportunistically with a great deal of understanding about what will and what will not fly with the American press and what will and will not fly with the American public. Looked at from their perspective, do you see any genuine disincentive for them to stop doing, or incentive for them to stop doing what they're doing now, since it seems to be working so well?
No. I would say I'm a real believer in the ill effects of hubris, and the only thing that can really bring it down, I think, is if they go too far, and we don't know how far they've gone. But no, they're riding high, and there's absolutely no reason for them to stop doing it. And the election is over. I don't think people are paying that close attention, and I don't blame them. The Iraq War, since the election there, has sort of gone in the back burner of American consciousness. And when people sort of channel surf through the news now, they hear often truly incomprehensible babble about Social Security that, as Don Imus was saying, it made his teeth hurt. I heard him this morning talking to some senator about it. And so I think so they'll just keep charging ahead. There's nothing to stop them.
Well, the brazenness of it is astonishing to me. I mean, you mentioned the Social Security thing. The outfit that handled the Swiftboat story is bragging in the New York Times about how they're going to destroy AARP and they're the boulder in the road, and they're going to blow them up. I mean, and they have been able to employ very apparently effective mechanisms of doing an ad, having it linked on the web, having it picked up. Maureen was writing about it today.
Yeah,
and it gets all the way to the op-ed page of the New York Times.
Dragging same-sex marriage into a debate about Social Security. It would be hilarious if it weren't, it didn't make you stop and think. No, they're very effective. But there again, you have to wonder whether hubris will eventually take a toll. As someone I think said in the Times account of it this morning, from the Cato Institute, a sort of libertarian organization, think tank, said, is it really good politics to go and attack, see the primary lobbyists for senior citizens? But these people are, they're ruthless. It's ruthless.
Let's look at the media part of this for just a moment, Frank, and that is the idea that the reason this is good is because it is still a perception in this country that the media is fundamentally reliable, objective. In other words, instead of just buying an ad, it is more credible. It is, no matter what people still say about the credibility of the media, it is worth it to go to a lot of trouble to have a message embedded in a news story as opposed to buying an ad for it, or that it seems to be handled that way. That an Armstrong Williams, who seems to be speaking his heart, is more valuable than an Armstrong Williams who announces that he's been paid for and therefore is speaking on that as a professional paid spokesman.
That's a very good point. It's sad we reach the point that's sort of the best thing we can find to show that the news still has credibility, that it's being exploited by people to undermine its credibility.
Well, oddly enough,
but no, it's a very good point. Yeah, go on.
Well, the thing is that the idea of objective reporting is that you're getting the straight story. Now, that a lot of people argue about that now, but the idea of it being the straight story, still in the minds of most people who consume, is the thing that gives value and in fact validates this information that is now being infused. I'm a believer in objectivity. There are not a lot of us around anymore. But I really worry about the execution and the standards in the American media, which simply are, it seems to me, especially at the local level, in smaller newspapers and on television, basically bending over and saying, we'll take the video news releases, we'll take whatever you'll give us, we'll take whatever.
Well, this has to do with some systemic problems, one of which is economic. The fact is that no one wants to pay for anything. Everyone wants to do everything in the cheap. And, remember, it wasn't that long ago when local stations, television news, maybe they were never, Edward R. Murrow, but they would very pointedly have civic-minded news coverage. They would have someone do an editorial about an issue of the day that affected the local community. They would have a Gabe Pressman, doing investigative reporting, knocking on doors. That is gone. My wife and I are great devotees of the local news in New York. It's sort of, it's sort of like Curb Your Enthusiasm and Quaaludes. And and we were watching either last night or the night before at 11 o'clock, and because rather than do any of those, there was no news happening. So they went and found, a horrible crime 100 miles away, or another part of the country, and not a red letter one, not something that might involve, like the Lacey Peterson story became, because that's, and they didn't have to pay for that. They probably got it from the affiliate and the local station from the same network. So it's all gone. That whole idea of public service is gone in broadcast news. It's just gone. And it really, in the 80s, when television was deregulated, during the Reagan administration, when it was declared that television is essentially an appliance like a toaster, that was it. It's just gone.
Well, if you give away local news on television, you give away network news, and you give away cable news, which is mostly now a conversation instead of reporting, and you have many small newspapers that don't really are having the same kind of economic problems. All newspapers are really.
Well, the big
Under a
papers
lot
are
of
having
pressure.
economic problems
I'm
too.
sorry?
The big papers are having economic problems too.
Of course. I mean, so what it looks like is a lake with all of these still remaining islands, but the water is rising. And sometimes you feel like there's only, the New York Times is going to be the last, the last island. It'll be like the tip of something, and then who knows what will happen after that. I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I'm not, because I think that there is a joker in the deck, and that is the blogosphere and the sort of the new technology that's coming on. Now, do you see blogging as something that is going to play a significant role in how this issue of propaganda, for instance, is perceived, how the idea of truth in journalism is going to be perceived? Because that's certainly something a lot of bloggers, from their own political perspectives, are taking on.
I don't know the answer to that question. Here were I'm sure everyone in this room knows the whole debate about blogging, and it's now become almost as the conversation about it has become almost as tedious as the selling of a Hollywood movie. But I would just raise a few questions about it. First of all, one thing about blogging is it takes a lot of time to read and a lot of time to write, even if you're not going through an editor. So it means only certain people have the time to do it and to read it. Because people talk about, and they're right, there's so much to read in the New York Times, and who has time for it all? And that's true to some extent, and you find what you want. But the same thing is true with blogging. Yes, you can click from one site to the next, but people are long-winded in blogging. They've given us. I'm not saying it's necessarily a character fault, but it's time-consuming. The intrinsic thing that concerns me about blogging, right now blogging means so many things. It's impossible to generalize. It means people doing opinion pieces or columns or rants. It means people exchanging very practical information. You can blog about real estate. You can blog about the stock market. And sometimes the high-profile examples have been bloggers finding flaws in the CBS News 60 Minutes report that Dan Rather did, and so on. But the fundamental problem is someone has to pay for the really difficult, costly news coverage. Right. You can be brilliant and sit in a room and look at some National Guard documents and see that they're hoaxes and point out the difference in the typefaces. But that doesn't cost you anything except time, although it does cost you time to do that, and maybe, when finding other people on the web who have that expertise. But Bill Keller, in fact, made this point in exchange with a blogger, Jeff Jarvis, on the web this week. Bill Keller being the executive editor of the Times, who's going to pay for Dexter Filkins to risk his life in Iraq? If it's all blogging, if it's all citizen journalists, who's going to pay for the incredibly costly and time-consuming investigation to find out what's going on in Enron, or what's going on with Armstrong Williams, or what would have been happening with Watergate? These huge, often derided mainstream news organizations. There is a raison d'etre, and the fact is, it takes manpower and money. And yes, I guess a blogger could be in, look, there are bloggers in Iraq, but it's not quite the same thing.
I think that Jeff Jarvis was here for a blogger journalism conference that Jill attended.
Oh, right.
Jill Abramson, the managing editor of the Times that we hosted. And I think I can say without any question that no bloggers there thought that blogging was going to replace journalism. They thought that blogging was going to be a complement to journalism. And they thought that blogging was going to tap the sort of infinite knowledge of all those people out there who apparently do have more time than they know what to do with, and so they spend incredible amounts of time doing stuff like that.
If that's true, that's great. And by the way, that's one of the great things in general about the internet, as we all know. It doesn't just relate to blogging, but the fact that there can be this community of information, and that, if you want to find that Shakespeare quotation you can't find, or that pancake recipe you wish you had, or 15, interesting views of the Bush administration, you can do it. But the problem for the mainstream media is, and this gets back to your initial question, is this going to what extent it takes over? If it takes over to enough of an extent, and it drags away the audience, and if the New York Times and CNNs and Washington Post are also free on the web, at some point it's like a perpetual motion machine.
Somebody's going to pay for it.
Someone's got to pay for it, or it's just going to go out of business.
No, I think that finding new models, if the advertising model is not going to support it the way it has, I don't know. I think that there's a real big issue.
It's a really big issue, and then you look at the networks, which because of the deregulation, but also because they've been bought by essentially movie studios, show business companies. They don't want to pay the money. All they've been doing is cutting back, as we know, foreign correspondence and so on for years, and investigative work. There's almost no investigative work on television. There is occasionally, and like CBS with Abu Ghraib, for instance. But I thought it was hilarious when the head of NBC was chortling at a sort of press conference for the TV press in California a couple of weeks ago and saying, ever since we had that Dateline scandal where they did that phony piece about a truck exploding, it was so long ago, we battened down the hatches and had all these standards, and what happened with the National Guard story on CBS never could have happened here. But who can remember any investigative reporting on NBC since that? Dateline is now about celebrities and crime, and it's Stone Phillips, perhaps eponymously named, sort of standing there and narrating prefab stories.
The question that comes down ultimately in my mind at the end is, given the idea of propaganda, and this is covert propaganda we're talking about, illegal propaganda, the Armstrong-Williams, the hiring people to be journalists, the insinuation of information into the news bloodstream by a calculated way, sanctioned and paid for by the administration. Why does the public not seem to be moved by that?
I think these things take a while, first of all, to develop. What's very much center stage to those of us in this profession takes time to fan out, and people do have other things to do. I mean, people are on the run, and there's no real crisis in the country right now. There may be, but there's none that's sort of front and center. It may be, too, that there's burnout. Between 9/11 and everything following, climaxing with the invasion of Iraq and the election campaign, people may have just overdosed on it and they're tuning out altogether. However, that doesn't bother me. I feel that people will tune in at some point. I'm not someone who takes the attitude that, why don't the Americans wake up and so on. I think, if we in journalism do our job properly and get the information out there, maybe I'm naive, but I think ultimately it will have an impact. And I think also we don't know the whole story yet, so we're just still beginning to report the story.
Well, one of the things you mentioned when you began your remarks was that so many people in this country have either willfully chosen not to believe the story of the truth about 9/11, or don't know, have not bothered to inform themselves. I guess my question is, do you see in the world of a politicized media, people selecting the reality that they prefer and simply stopping there? And I mean, the question, it would seem to me, gets down to whether people are willing to be informed in an environment like this, or whether they have simply, in large numbers anyway, decided that that's not the way they're going to go about informing themselves.
Look, the big fear, and everyone in this business is talking about it, is that, if you're conservative, you'll only want to watch Fox or, read the Washington Times or read conservative bloggers. And if you're liberals, not to say NPR is liberal, but you'll choose things that you think are likely, you'll listen to Air America or whatever. That is a scary proposition because it means both sides are completely out of touch with reality because they're just hearing advocacy, they're not hearing the news. However, to play devil's advocate with the view that that's the way it's going, you have to look at some numbers. And the fact is that Fox News, it's very successful and it's very financially successful, but it's not having network-size audiences. You know, on a great night, Bill O'Reilly has half the audience of what's far and away the lowest rated of the 3 network newscasts, the rather CBS Evening News. There's still a big circulation for a lot of things in mainstream journalism and print as well, including the Times, including the news magazines. So I don't know the answer to if what we're seeing, this sort of polarization of people who are very committed on the right and the left, is really representative of the country, or just really representative of people who are really on the right and on the left, and that there might be a middle that still says, oh, I'm going to look at Peter Jennings, or I'm going to pick up USA Today or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, whatever, and the Chicago Tribune, and still want something that I think is objective. The noise of both talk radio, cable news, and the blogosphere is so loud right now that maybe we're confusing volume with its actual impact. We don't really know, what these numbers are, and it's not that these things aren't real threats to institutions like the New York Times, which does have to figure out how to, like every big paper, how to get news to people who only want on the internet, but also make money off of it. Those are really profound issues, but New York Times has an enormous readership on its website, probably, I dare say, more than any blogger by far, and probably more than Fox News' website, or on the left, The Guardian and The Independent, in London, or whatever the liberal equivalent would be here. So I think there's still, we can't call this over yet, but we don't know, and we're in a very polarized time.
Do you think the Times was damaged badly by the effort by the Bush administration during the campaign to really sort of brand it as hyper-liberal and so forth? I mean, that may have happened before, but there seemed to be a concerted effort to...
There's definitely a concerted effort, and what damage it's done, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to measure that, but to me it reached a climax and was most reprehensible when we published several weeks before the election, because that's when we reported it, that's when we could report it out, a story about these weapons being looted in Iraq after the invasion. And immediately you saw the Republican talking points, mainly on Fox, liberal newspaper. The story's been proven false. And people are just saying it's a bogus story. Hosts were saying that on cable news. It was not a bogus story, and it was verified by a number of news organizations, including competing ones like the Los Angeles Times, which actually found American soldiers who witnessed it happening a few days after the election. But they have a big megaphone, and if they want to go after any news organization, they can. And what we have to do in response is not overreact to it or really react to it, except by doing the best job we can to just keep reporting and keep our eye on the ball, which is to not have news that caters to anybody.
Let me...
any political group.
I want to go to the questions. There are microphones here, there, here, and here. If you line up at the mic, I will call on you in turn. Let me ask, while people are coming to the microphones, how widely are you read now, do you think?
Me, personally?
Because, you went from the op-ed page to Arts and Leisure. I know you're on the website. Does the Times syndicate your column?
Yeah, whatever that means, since we don't see the money. I've never known how widely I've read. I get a lot of response, but I don't, it's all anecdotal evidence. But I feel, I have a readership. Some loves it, some hates it. Fine. And
do you have a thick skin, Frank?
At this point, yes, most of the time. After look, if I could just stand up to Andrew Lloyd Webber and the Schuberts, I think I can stand up to these political people.
Yes,
anyway,
if you would identify yourself.
Yes, you hear me? I'm Harry Gorally, graduated from the mid-career program in 2003. Quick question following up on just the title of the program tonight, propaganda. I just wanted to suggest, as we talk about the blogosphere, that maybe we should think about the bloggers as a kind of samizdat. If you think about the old Soviet Union, people are self-publishing because they're not feeling like they're getting all the information from trusted sources. Now, I will say, as a Times reader and a person who loves the New York Times, I do know that I get a lot of information first from the blogs before it hits the Times, the Post, or any of the other organizations. And my first question is that something that the Times feels squeamish about or embarrassed about? If you take the Jeff Gannon story, for example, why is it the blogs that are breaking the Jeff Gannon story? Or why is it the blogs that are telling us that at Bush administration events, that the events are orchestrated, that people are carried out if they're from the wrong party, et cetera?
So, I couldn't hear that last sentence.
At Bush events, the open forums that are not open forums, they're all stacked.
So do papers have some responsibility for showing that the village is not real? And why is it the blogs are leading the effort in that regard and not the New York Times?
Well, first of all, we don't like to be beaten on any story. And so it's not a philosophical thing. We'd like to break every story. And sometimes we don't. I mean, we missed Watergate. We were behind on Watergate. We've had areas where we've led and areas where we've been beaten by competition, and we welcome competition, whether it comes from blogs or other mainstream news organizations or whatever. I don't buy, as a general principle, that the Times or institutions like it have been ignoring looking inside the tent. I mean, we, for instance, years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, did a piece, I wish I could remember who wrote it, it may have been Elizabeth Pugh Miller, on the front page about the staging of a Bush PR opportunity where he was made to look like one of the faces on Mount Rushmore. And we had the picture, and the Gannon's, the Gannon story may have been broken by bloggers. The Armstrong-Williams story was, and both of the other columnists who were paid by the Bush administration were broken by USA Today in print. So it's a competitive world.
The Times broke the video news release story.
We broke the video news release. We broke the Karen Ryan story. So there's the blogs have, to me, a particularly embarrassing thing for the mainstream media was the Trent Lott story. That was out there for everyone to see. It was on C-SPAN, but a blogger or two noticed it, and we fell behind. But I don't think there's any philosophy that we're trying not to get these things. We're out there every day, breaking our necks trying to do it, and competition is good. It's good that bloggers or competitors are breathing down our neck and forcing us to be better. And the worst thing that could happen is to have no competition and just be sitting there complacent, and we're not.
My name is Jama Adams. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the Bush administration's efforts on specifically Social Security, maybe tax cuts, maybe the war, but kind of in the recent past and looking into the future, kind of how do you see that playing out in terms of the ill effects of hubris?
Well, if you're talking about the policies, that probably is sort of beyond the purview of what we're talking about. If you're talking about the propaganda piece of it, we're just beginning on the Social Security thing. Certainly the Swift Boats allied group going after the AARP is, in my view, a hubristic step, and I can't believe it's being done with the Bush administration being completely ignorant of it. Other things that they're doing, it's not necessarily propaganda, it's just packaging. They obviously, a focus group has told them not to use the word privatization anymore, and so they don't. But that's, they all do that. Every politician does that in the modern age. It doesn't make it good, but that's not really propaganda in the sense we're talking about. And I think in terms of the issue of the economy and tax cuts and the deficit, if there's hubris there, it's policy hubris. I mean, they're not look, they make misstatements. They underestimated by what, $300 and some million before the election the Medicare drug benefit. But that spin, and I think anyone who believed their estimate going in is naive. And that's the kind of thing politicians do all the time. I do think that kind of spin and sort of disingenuousness and making up figures, the Iraq war was going to cost, what, $1.7 billion? That's standard practice with politicians and has been for years. And that may be reprehensible, but also the public has to be a bit skeptical when they're handed, this kind of bull. That's quite a different thing from creating a fake newsman and creating fake news stories and sending these sort of, to use what I wrote 40 years ago, 35 years ago, these sort of Manchurian candidate type newsmen going out and appearing in cable shows when they're being paid by the administration.
I mean, I think it was very interesting. As you know, at the New York Times, there was a big flap some time back about whether the CIA had basically taken the identity of a New York Times reporter, and this was back in Bush Senior's time.
God, I don't even remember that.
Well, the thing was, it was before our time at the Times, but the issue was taken very, very seriously because the idea of an intelligence agent assuming the identity of a journalist was considered to be, really an appalling thing. And the newspaper and the news industry got up in arms. I don't see them up in arms. I don't see anybody. If this is against the law, why isn't anyone being charged? Why isn't anybody being considered for criminal behavior?
Well, I agree with you. I think, and I think that, editorial pages can call for this, but in the end, we have a government that has to, in the end, Congress would have to get involved. GAO has gotten involved. It is investigating Armstrong Williams. They seem to be fairly rapacious as investigators. I would like, as the previous questions, I'd like to see us and everyone, bloggers, everybody do more investigative journalism about this. But also investigative stories aren't built in a day, as you know.
Sure.
And no one, I'm not saying this is Watergate, but just to go back to the history of Watergate, there were months when Woodward and Bernstein were out there and the entire rest of the press, including us, it was before my time there, but I remember as a reader, were ignoring it. So someone then, the question that previous question had said about bloggers, someone would say, and they did at the time, why isn't the New York Times on this story? And we weren't until very, very late in the game.
Yes, up here.
Hi, I'm Erin Carmone, senior at the college, Crimson editor. I was wondering, one of the things that the internet has contributed but has also taken place in print is a general upsurge in media criticism and media reporting on the media. I'm wondering, and given that your column as of late has been pretty media focused, I'm wondering if you think that this is having a salutary or regulating effect on the media, or what effect at all it's having on journalism that's not about journalism.
I don't know. I wish I could answer. It's hard to gauge. I mean, I think it has some effect. I think when, speaking of some, when the Times is criticized, I think we look at it, and if it's a legitimate criticism, we take it seriously. And I imagine other news organizations and journalists behave exactly the same way. But the media is so large, the media are so large, that whether you're writing a column like mine, or you're writing a blog, or you're writing a column somewhere else, or you're giving commentary on television, it's like trying to move the Queen Mary. It's so huge. It's not something that can be sort of, like budged in a lump. And my own feeling is that the best hope for journalism is that people like you go into it, that younger people still want to go into it, and want to go into it for the right reasons, not to be, network anchors, but really want to find news and convey it. And that, to me, is really the best hope. And I'm not saying it in some sort of sentimental way, because you know, we're here and you're a student, I really do believe it, that you know, people have new people have to be idealistic and make it better, make us better.
One of the anomalies of this is that one of the newspapers that's been following the propaganda story most closely, from my perspective, I believe, is the Houston Chronicle, which is the Bush's hometown paper, effectively.
Well, they've done some very good reporting. You know, there are two interesting places where neither of which are in addition to the blog reporting on the Gannon story and whatever has been contributed by other organizations. One is the Houston paper because of this GOP USA Talon News website that spawned this Jeff Gannon or whatever his name is, this you know, prostitute who's got a press pass for 2 years. We don't know quite how got in the White House under an assumed name, but anyway, that organization is run by Texas Republicans, so it's in their backyard, and they've shown a lot of initiative. Another publication you wouldn't expect, it's been just a bulldog on this story, is Editor and Publisher, which is, how would you say, it's like a trade publication of sort of journalism, I guess. It's not something you normally think of.
It's the newspaper business trade publication.
Yeah, so it'd be like if Variety were doing it in a sense, and they've had a reporter or two on this that have, you know, been on it almost every day and added new things. Also, again, just so we know, another person who's been on it is, in addition to the bloggers and these people, is Eric Bollert, a very good reporter at Salon magazine, which is not a blog but an actual news magazine. And you know, I wish we had those stories. I wish the Washington Post, you know, some of the Post coverage, Howie Kurtz's coverage, has been good on it too. So,
yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Dina. I'm a freshman at the college. My question is about White House news conferences. I don't really watch C-SPAN that often, but you know, turning it on recently, I did happen to see just one of the regular White House news conferences, and I was very surprised to see that you know, a reporter will ask a question and it just won't be answered, and that's just like the common practice. I mean, the same answer is just repeated over and over and over again. And you know, I never knew that that's what news conferences were like. So I'm
I'm so sorry your innocence has been smashed so early on as an undergraduate. What goes on now, and it's not just at news conferences, it's also in interviews on television, and it's not limited to this administration or any political party. Politicians or their spokespeople, press secretaries and so on, come into these situations with the answers they want to give regardless of what the questions are. And they're just going to do it. And John Kerry would have did it, and George Bush would do it. And so they're really, it is like watching something out of, you know, Stalinist Russia or something, or Kabuki. It's just a complete, and I understand you're shocked, but if you watch a few more years, you'll just be completely hardened like the rest of us.
I mean, I guess my question is, why isn't this sort of reported in the media as such? You know, like I never read an article where it's like, there was a news conference, this question was asked, and here's the answer that was given. You know, I feel like maybe with that, I mean, I don't know that much about it, but if there was that sort of more aggressive reporting where people who read the New York Times but say don't regularly tune in to C-SPAN.
Well, periodically, wouldn't you say, Alex, periodically places like us write that story. You know, like once a political season, we'll write the sort of deconstruction story. Every paper does it. You know, it was asked 17 times when we're getting out of Iraq, and the answer was, you know, have a nice day, or whatever. So, you know, essentially I think what news organizations do is when it's all just nonsense, you know, we try to find out where the news really is rather than what's being put out in these dog and pony shows. You know, and they're not completely without merit, because Jeff Gannon, we still don't know what he's been using them for past years. It had nothing to do with news, but you know, it may have been a networking or business opportunity.
But if the point of this discussion here is what is the procedure and the process as much as the content, then maybe it ought to be given more attention.
No, maybe it should be, and I was on the plane here this evening. This afternoon, I was reading Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail, his account of the '72 campaign, and right at the very beginning, he just, it's incredible how little has changed. We have all this new media, but at the very beginning, he's just saying, all these people just want to be in the club. He said they all, dressed well. They all were friends with each other. No one ever asked a real question. There was absolutely no point in participating in an official political press event, and so it's.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Centuria, class of '57 at Wilson High School, by the way, which
10
but
years
now a member of the Institute for Learning and Retirement here at Harvard. My question relates to a different kind of propaganda. I just applied for Medicare, and when I called the Social Security office, I was put on hold.
I know about this.
And I received a message on hold, that is, the thing that was playing while you're on hold
Commercial.
is a commercial for the Bush Social Security policy. To me, that's propaganda, and I was wondering, do you place it in the realm of propaganda?
I do, and I've listened to it. I've heard about it from a number of readers, and someone may write about it. It's because it actually somewhat misstates.
Misstates is a fair way to put it.
And it's as if you call up American Airlines and you start hearing about our new fares to Hawaii or whatever, and they're giving you somewhat bogus fares.
Yes.
While they keep you on hold before you can get what you really want. No, and so that's why I feel we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. That one is so hiding in plain sight, it's not even hiding, because how many people call that number a day?
But
Millions.
I've never seen it reported in the news, and I'm wondering, is it newsworthy?
It is newsworthy.
Well,
Yes.
I agree. I agree. It's been on my mind. If no one else gets it there before I do, I suspect someone will do it. I'll see to it.
Hi, my name is Ines Vojka, and I'm a student here. And 2 lives ago, I was a journalist myself, and I'm still a member of Investigative Reporters and Editors here in the US. And today we heard a lot about the pressures journalists experience in this country from their owners and from political sphere. We hear the pressures from bloggers. Do you see the role of journalistic organizations as something that can help to preserve the journalistic profession in this country?
You mean like professional organizations? Well, a lot of, it's not something I'm wildly familiar with, but I know, there is obviously an investigative journalist group that shares information and has involved a lot of, major talents in that field. There's the Committee to Protect Journalists, which plays an incredibly vital role when journalists are really put under, physical threat. But whether they really affect the overall tide of journalism over time, I don't know enough to know. What would you think?
Well, I think that it's interesting. When I first, I'm from a small newspaper background, and I was the editor of a small newspaper, and I was a member, therefore, of the American Society of Newspaper Editors back in the 1970s. And when you'd go to the American Society of Newspaper Editors meetings in those days, this was the editors of the newspapers from all over the country. They were like labor union meetings. I mean, they were people up, railing about publishers and how we're going to beat them and what we have to do to keep them off our backs. And I mean, it was really a us versus them environment with the publishers, the bean counters versus the journalists on the news side. Over time, that has sort of morphed because it's become much more likely that the editors became the publishers. And when the editors became the publishers, they adopted many of the publishers' priorities and many of the publishers' points of view. So if you go to an American Society of Newspaper Editors meeting now, it's really not all that different from going to the meeting of the Newspaper Association of America, which is the publishers' organization. Now, it doesn't mean that they're without value. They do have value. But there is not like the kind of aggressive, serious journalistic, passionate feeling. It's also, of course, the fact that the newspaper business changed over that time, and most of the people who are now the editors of newspapers work for editors for chains of newspapers and their sort of career people who have been chosen to be editors for reasons that may be different than they used to. So it's important, but it's unclear what the role. Those news organizations should play a serious role, but I don't think they play nearly the role they should. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi. Excuse me. My name is Dave Buck. I'm from Cambridge. I think there's a feedback problem here. And I have a general question, maybe difficult to answer. Do you have some suggestions on how citizens and activists can have some impact on the atrophy of the media, or the atrophy of journalism that you've been talking about? Whether maybe it's through putting certain kinds of pressure on local newspapers, maybe on some of the larger media organizations, or anything else that comes to your mind?
I don't know. I mean, I really feel news organizations want to hear from readers, and more, the Times is particularly chastened after our calamity of a couple of years ago, has now, so opened itself up through public editor in our case, ombudsman, and, the Washington Post and other papers. So I think, criticism that's smart and accurate does have an impact. I also feel, when people complain to me about television news, or about television in general, not even just television news, that there's the power of the purse. You don't have to buy a newspaper or magazine, and you don't have to contribute to the Nielsen ratings of something that you think is, deleterious to society. One of the great hypocrisies I feel in America is that people complain about lousy news or indecency in television while gobbling it up at every possible opportunity. If it didn't have an economic basis, it would die. You also can support news organizations that you really believe in, whether it be a blogger who needs money. A lot of bloggers ask for donations to be able to afford to stay online and turn it into something of a job, or smaller publications, or if you believe in your local public television or radio, you can also put your money where you want your mouth to be, as well as taking it away from the places you don't want to be. But I think criticism really is permeating news media now, but no news organization is perfect, and 40 people could write the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Washington Post and say, you've got to cover this wonderful altruistic event that we're having in the town square because we think we've got 4 people speaking about the most important issue of the day, and it's so important. And we can say, yeah, that sounds great, but if a bigger story happens, it's going to be knocked out. That's the way the news business works.
Sure. And actually, I'm more concerned just about the growing lack of public service orientation that you were talking about earlier.
Right. Well, I think, you're really talking about particularly local media, particularly local television, but in some cases newspapers. But a lot of mainstream newspapers do a lot of local stuff, whether it be us or the LA Times, the Miami Herald, the Chicago Tribune, or the Globe, really do interesting, investigative local journalism. But many places, particularly in smaller areas, can no longer afford to do it, no longer have the motivation to do it. But this is not so much a problem in places like Boston and New York. It's more a problem in smaller metropolitan centers.
Hi, my name is Paloma. I'm a junior at the college. The New York Times is often referred to as the paper of record or the gold standard. Do you think that the New York Times occupies a position of leadership in the field of journalism?
Does it occupy a position of leadership in the field of journalism?
Yes.
Yeah, I do, and I think it does, in spite of its flaws and in spite of its scandals. It's hardly perfect, as I've said before, but I'd say the one, the Times, at its best, does try to cover authoritatively what its editors think is important, and that includes not only things that are in everybody's face, like a war, but what is really going on in the minutia of Medicaid regulations, what is really going on in the bottom of a negotiation in Albany or in Brussels. And that's a mission that's always been at the paper, or has been for over 100 years. It's very costly. It's often not commercial. Doesn't, you know, and I think that is, you know, puts it in a position. It's not unique. There are other great papers in this country too, and there are papers that beat us on some things. But I think all of the better papers have that in mind. They want to do, you know, they want to do good in the sense that they really want to bring accurate news to people and find accurate news about not just the story that's leading the evening news that night, not just the Michael Jackson trial. We'll do that too, and not just what the President of the United States said that day, but the stuff that's hidden in the shadows. And if it didn't try to do that, half the people there wouldn't work there, because that's why you go there. It's not to make a lot of money or anything. It's because that is a mission you believe in. And it's up to others to say whether, you know, to what extent we succeed or fail. And we succeed sometimes and we fail sometimes.
I think it's important to note that Frank is not only an essayist, he is also an associate editor at the New York Times, which means he's on the masthead, which means he's one of the...
Well, not on the masthead, but I've been playing an editorial role for a couple of years in redoing. Well, this is a good example of the Times. This is a good example of something I think that the Times at its best does. I can also tell you the Times at its worst, but we've spent 2 years, and this is what I've been involved with as an editor, redoing the culture report of the Times. It's been very costly. We've literally added columns of space, all of which cost money, to the daily art section. We've created almost 20 new jobs. We've hired all sorts of new editors and writers. And why are we doing it? Most newspapers in the country have cut back cultural coverage, with very, very few exceptions. So have most magazines. When I worked at Time magazine as a film critic in the late 70s, there was a full-time drama critic, a full-time dance critic, a full-time classical music critic. That's all been downsized, just about everywhere. Not to mention newspapers, but we believe it's something we can do. It's something that we can at our best do well. We're in, if I may say so, in the culture capital of the United States, at least, if not the world. So it's our story in our backyard, and doesn't mean all our coverage is perfect, but that's, to me, that was a decision made. It's something people like me lobbied for, but the corporation had to do it. It's not like something that's raking in the bucks, or that by adding a full-time classical music reporter, which we did, the first paper in the country probably ever to have one, suddenly we're getting all these huge, chamber music display ads, or tons of new readers at a time when classical music is dying in the record industry. So, that's what the Times tries to do, and sometimes it screws up, but sometimes it actually tries to do something a little bit noble.
2 more questions.
My name is Donald Green. I'm a physician from Reading, and I'd like to take advantage of Mr. Rich's thick skin, because I'm, like many people, in search of reliable news. And I feel that the Times many times failed in this aspect. I can think of a front page story that ran several pages on these tapes that Mr. Bush apparently was recorded secretly by what he considers a friend, and yet we learn nothing of who Mr. Weed is, and this is not hard information to obtain, so these things are put in proper light. In fact, when someone does not release all their tapes to you so you can see the full context of what's going on, it should not wind up on the front page of a newspaper going several pages long. We need protection from, we need our first freedom of values, and that's freedom from harm. And we need the information to help us to do that. And I feel that the Fourth Estate in general has failed in this job. So I want to know, in the back rooms, what is the call to action to help us to get this information that we need so that we don't have thousands of people dying in the world needlessly and with the untimeliness that the news that we are getting. I mean, we get scoops, but they're untimely.
Well, I don't agree with you. Do we miss stories? Absolutely. But let's take the example you gave. I could sit here, I know everything about Doug Weed. I've written about him in a previous piece. We've written about him. He is exactly, and we wrote about him in this one, and we did a second piece on it. He is this hanger-on who was friends with his father. He's this sort of evangelical proselytizer and publicist who wanted to sell a book. And I think that's an incredible scoop that we got these tapes. No one else did. We got them first, and then other people followed us. And they're not. I very much doubt that George Bush, talked to Doug Weed about his plans for Iran. And believe me, if he had, and had been played for the terrific reporter David Kirkpatrick who did this, they would have been the story. The idea that we're covering something up in this case is absurd.
I don't think you're covering something up, but there wasn't enough in-depth information in there so the public could properly evaluate who this person was.
Right, well, that's a judgment you're entitled to make, and I would only say...
he's an Amway executive.
Right.
In France, he was, I think, indicted or looking to be indicted because of his business practices.
Believe me,
he's
we've been
an
looking...
unreliable person.
All right, you may be the world's greatest expert on Doug Weed, but believe me, we're reporting everything on him we can. We had another interview with him. Did it run today, yesterday?
Today.
Not every, if you go back in any history of investigative journalism in the United States, not all the facts are in the first story. You get the information as you have it, and as soon as it's ready to be published, you publish it. You don't make the mistake of publishing it before you have it nailed down. So if you're saying he was indicted, my guess is if we had that information reliably, we would have printed it. And if it is reliable, we'll get it. But we can't just stand up at a microphone and say it. We have to actually, find sources and make sure they're right. Just as we took these tapes to an expert to authenticate, to not take Weed's word for it, that they were authentic.
Final question up here.
Hi, my name is Dave. I'm a senior at the college. In light of the overwhelming vote on FCC indecency fines, I guess it was a week or two ago, it seems like there's no politically viable way to advocate for indecency. So is there any way that, or is there any hope for countering what seems to be an unfightable, how do we counter the Parents Television Council?
I feel it's all up to my son at the Harvard Lampoon. I actually have written about this for this weekend. I've written a column about indecency again. I think there are ways to counter it. First of all, again, people are voting with their pocketbooks. They're voting for Desperate Housewives. I think that the publication Media Week has reported that indeed, like 99% plus of the indecency complaints indeed come from this Parents Television Council, which is one guy, Brent Bozell, with 1 million members, but membership, it just means you sign up on the website. It doesn't cost a dime, although I'm sure he collects donations from them. But I think what's going to happen, and what I put in the column, and which is a hunch that now there's some stories coming out, I think that some of the networks are going to challenge it. The rules are so ill-defined, and these issues have not been addressed in a major court case since the I think since the George Carlin 7-word case in the Pacifica in 1978. And so my guess is these very powerful networks, quite possibly including and led by Rupert Murdoch's Fox, ironically enough, may well go to court. And I think the only reason they haven't is something else that's sort of ugly about all this, is all these companies, of course, want handouts from the FCC. So they don't want to cross them about anything because they want the rights to buy more and they want more deregulation and so forth. But I think the indecency stuff may have overplayed its hand, which is not to take it lightly, because it could well destroy, if it isn't already, public television, which, unlike the networks, won't go to court, can't go to court, is very vulnerable, and which may be being turned, even as we speak, into a propaganda operation. The fact that a Secretary of Education on her first day of the job could go in and target a children's show produced by the public station here and essentially deep six it, that's pretty amazing. And that's, by the way, the same Department of Education that gave us the payments to Armstrong Williams. But I think in terms of commercial culture, the networks are going to win. They're just too powerful, they have too much money, and the laws just don't make sense. And because they don't make sense, that's why 66 ABC stations censored Saving Private Ryan, which they had run 2 years earlier to no complaints and with no cutting. I think the public has a say in this, and I wonder if this indecency crusade would have the ballast it does if it hadn't been for this sort of moral values storyline that came out of the exit polls on Election Day and has sort of driven these people to be sort of drunk with their presumed power. It's really interesting, take Parents Television Council, Bozell or people connected with him went on, television and said, Postcards from Buster, this PBS show, was advocating lesbianism, whatever the hell that means, which is hardly the case. And they did criticize The Simpsons for having same-sex marriage last Sunday. But it's a game. I mean, this is sort of what I've written about for this week. It's a game. They know that, first of all, Murdoch is the patron of the politicians they believe in. They're not going to really go after The Simpsons, a big hit show which is much more explicit about homosexuality and same-sex marriage and skeptical about religion and everything else. In prime time, in the commercial network, they're going to go after this little, tiny educational show for toddlers. They're going to be bullies where they can throw their weight around.
Frank, Rich, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was fun. That was fun.
Good.